good afternoon to Jim O'Hagan.
Good afternoon, Walter. Ask anyone today what the names of the main Belfast businesses of yesteryear were, and I'm sure the answers would include Harland and Wolff, the Rope Works, Sirocco, and some linen firms. But there was another name very prominent in the life of industrial Belfast, and that was Mackies. In lots of ways it was a unique place to work in. The origins of the firm, James Mackie and Sons Limited, go back to the middle part of the 19th century and to Albert Street in the city. For it was there that James Scrimgeour began making textile machinery with his manager, James Mackie. Mackie, who was also a Scot, but some say was born in Germany, had previously worked in Drogheda, installing steam engines at a flax spinning mill. Scrimgeour's business went into liquidation, but Mackie took it over in 1846 with 4 employees. And by 1892 his firm, much expanded, was making in excess of 100 wet spinning frames a year for the flax industry here, as well as many other items vital to production in that trade. By the end of the 19th century, Mackies and the rival firm of Coombe Barber were the next largest engineering firms outside of the shipyards. Walter, this was the great era for this type of work. They made the complete range of flax machinery. Mackies moved from Albert Street to the premises from which they were known best in 1893. These were situated at Springfield Road, then in the country, and occupied a large block extending back to Forfar Street and across from Forfar Street. Apparently Forfar Street was called after Mackie's home part of Scotland. The firm was known as the Albert Foundry in commemoration of his origins in Albert Street and became world famous. Just for interest, other foundries in the early decades of the 20th century included Ritchie Hart, Mount Pottinger Road, Musgrave and Company known as St Anne's Works, situated on the Albert Bridge Road, Hamilton's of Percy Street, the Brown Square Foundry, Stephen Cotton's in Sydney Street West, and J.J. McKeown's Grosvenor Road. It was the sons of the original James Mackie, James Jr. and Tom, who moved the firm to the Springfield Road, and in time many workers from rival establishments joined Mackie's, including Walter Barber, whose own firm had closed down in the 30s and who brought several of that firm's patents with him. Within the past few years, I was fortunate to gain access to the memoirs of a man now deceased who started working in Mackie's in the 1930s as a young apprentice and who stayed employed there for the next 40-odd years. The memoirs make extremely interesting and often very amusing reading. In the 1930s, the full apprenticeship in the firm lasted 7 years and 9 months. The mind boggles when one considers how relatively short apprenticeships are today when compared with this. Also, let's for the sake of the story call my informant Sean. He says that Mackie's had a very bad reputation for dismissing young men when they came to be entitled to full wages as journeymen. Sean paints a grim picture of working conditions there, especially for apprentices. As well as a full day every day from 8 a.m. to 5:30 or 6, everyone worked until 12:30 p.m. on a Saturday. Saturday morning work was not apparently an exercise in filling in time. No, the lads had to scrupulously clean the machines and benches and brush underneath. The machinery was, I suppose, like that in many other similar establishments, archaic. Dust and grime flew everywhere, everything being done manually. Safety regulations were at a bare minimum. Goggles for eye protection would have been ridiculed, whilst I shudder to think what the overall effect would have been on asthma or dust allergy sufferers. All manual workers, including tradesmen, had to be present for work at 8 a.m. sharp, otherwise they were sent home. To be late courted the risk of the sack. Later conditions regarding starting time were relaxed somewhat. One was tolerated lateness of not more than 15 minutes 3 times per month. If this was breached, one's privileges for the next month were cancelled. Breaks for the toilets were 7 minutes in length, morning and afternoon. They became known as the sevens. There were no flush toilets. Smoking was not allowed, and this was very strictly observed, though many workers tried all sorts of dodges in order to smoke. Sean recalls how funny it was to witness some of these, with the foreman waving his cap in the air to waft away the smoke. There were no tea breaks in the firm, and this lasted for as long as Sean recalled, even into the 1980s. In his own words, tools were very strictly rationed, and some apprentices and older workers sweated blood when a hacksaw blade was broken. The wages paid to workers in the early to middle 1930s make for very interesting comparison with today's rates. For instance, a fitter then got £3.12 and 6 per week. A final year apprentice 25 shillings. 15-year-olds got 6 shillings. 16-year-olds 7 shillings less 14 pence for a national insurance stamp. So you worked in your second year for less take-home pay than in your first. In the next year, one got 9 shillings per week, and their proportionate increases until 25 shillings per week was reached. James Sr. died in the late 19th century in 1888, before the move to Springfield Road, and as I've said, the business was continued under his sons, James Jr. and Tom, who were responsible for different areas. Sean relates how he viewed both partners. James Jr. to him was a gentleman for whom it was a pleasure to work, whilst Tom was the opposite, a hard taskmaster and very exacting. The wages were topped up by a monthly bonus of 2 and 2pence or 2 and 6 if the machine or parts were finished before the allotted time. Sean reminds me, however, that the bonus was very hard earned. One's hands would remind you of that, with their assortment of blisters and calluses. The wages were paid on Friday afternoons with a separate oblong piece of metal from the entrance one, needing to be produced as proof of identity. These were called cheques. Incidentally, one had to produce an entrance cheque with your number on it to gain admission to the sevens, or toilet breaks, morning and afternoon. Regarding toilet breaks, Walter reminds me of the chap who worked years ago in Short Brothers in Harland, and who told me his Daily Mirror accompanied more of his fellow workers each day to the toilets than he cared to remember. One wonders, could they not have brought their own reading material? Anyhow, to get back to our own story, if one lost a cheque in Mackies in the 1930s, it cost 3d, 3 old pence to get another, which was deducted from wages. Speaking of the unduly long apprenticeship, apparently after a series of strikes, the apprenticeship time was cut to 6 years in the 1930s. Mackies recreation grounds were virtually on site, with the football and hockey pitches situated on Forfar Street. However, the coming of the Second World War changed this, as virtually all the machine shops were relocated in Forfar Street and the sports field moved to West Circular Road. I'm sure the sports-minded of your listeners remember Paisley Park there. Albert Foundry Sports Club was famous for many years and operated mainly out of these premises. The sports facilities were a feature of life in the firm, which was very notable. The fibre which was used in those days was virtually all jute, and the different systems of working it were baling, guarding, drawing and doubling, roving, spinning, reeling and twisting. To be a little technical, the surface speeds, drafts and leads were all vital operation for this system of jute spinning. Only slight modifications were needed for the flax system. The machines were very strictly guarded by patents, needing to be registered every 5 years to safeguard the interests of their makers. Sean states that the workers were not usually permitted to move from one department or shop during the day to another. So he found it a great thrill to be sent a message as an apprentice to the stores or the blacksmith's shop, where helping the smith was a great joy and welcome respite from continually using a file. One memory he had of the foundry side of the business was that it always reminded him of Dante's Inferno. A good comparison, I think. With the outbreak of World War II, life in Mackies changed utterly from the 1930s, with the firm now involved in munitions production, as it had been to a lesser degree in the 1914-18 war. The machines for making the shells were American. The hours of work changed. There was continuous production with sometimes 3 8-hour shifts, but more usually 2 12-hour stints for the workers. And the firm, like many others in Belfast, threw itself wholeheartedly into the war effort. The last order for textiles, a massive one, went to Japan. Sean said he often wondered whether the order arrived or not. Speaking of Mackies in wartime, Walter, reminds me of a true but funny story I heard as a young boy, and one I've remembered to this day. It concerned the night of the first Blitz in Belfast in 1941. A relative of mine was awoken by all the noise and blasting going on. She and her husband lived near Belfast city centre, I suppose about 2.5 miles from Mackies, by then well known as a munitions factory. She was a lady of a rather nervous disposition who immediately roused her husband from sleep and inquired of him as to what was happening. He fairly quickly realised an air raid was in progress, but being a rather phlegmatic man, did not wish to alarm his wife. To her repeated nervous questioning as to what was happening, he quietly reassured her with the words, "Go back to sleep, Mary. Sure, it's only the workers practising in Mackies." For some reason I feel that's one of the funniest stories I have heard about the Second World War. The results of all the blasting and blattering were not funny though, especially to that lady when she heard the true story the next morning and the resulting disaster for Belfast. Actually, the Mackies district received a severe blasting as the Germans considered it a marked area. Sean tells in his story how women took over as workers on the shell machines. The firm now specialised in armour-piercing shells, and 16,000 people overall, some say, were employed by the firm at this time. One gripe he has in his story is his assertion that the total number of Catholics employed never amounted to more than 200, and that in his words, never at any time when he worked there was there a Catholic foreman, despite the Springfield site being situated in an area with a large Catholic population. Having said that, he goes on to state that never at any time was his own Catholic religion insulted or his own beliefs not respected. He enjoyed excellent relationships with workmates of all religions and none. During the war, parts of the firm had moved to other sites. They took over McGladdery's brickyard, later called Woodvale. They also took over Wolf Hill Mill, and both the Woodvale site and it were involved with aircraft production. Sean was seconded to the ropework site and worked there for long stints, cleaning, repairing and building carding and spinning machines. He was glad, he says, to be away from the excessive oil and dermatitis-causing shell shops. Over 75 million shells were produced and 1,150 complete sets of tail planes, including rudders, and 75 Sterling fuselages were completed with all the elaborate fittings in, such as gun turrets, as part of the war effort. In the war period, great stress was put on entertainment for the employees. In this, the company was very enlightened, and a number of social groups were formed to add to the soccer, hockey and athletic clubs. The athletic club was always very successful, and after the war, if memory serves me right, some athletes attached to the club became Empire and Commonwealth Games participants. The cross-country section was always strong. Later too, boxing became a part of the activities and made the name Albert Foundry famous. In the years Sean speaks of, there was an angling club at White Rock Dam, a bowling club and a swimming club. They had a successful water polo team, of which Sean was a proud member, which met on Thursday evenings at the Falls Road Baths. Another member was Pat Convery, who was the Irish international goalkeeper in the sport. This section of the sports club organised a very popular life-saving course, which was held every year. Mackies also had a military band and a male voice choir, which was very well supported and very successful. Many of these activities were coordinated by an entertainment and publicity officer. A company of the Home Guard was formed, which held its summer camp at Grey Point. They paraded to Helens Bay Presbyterian Church under the leadership of Harry McClintock and Peter Paisley, the managing director of the firm. Sean pokes gentle fun at this company of the Home Guard. Apparently a report was made on them by a Colonel Mulholland, who must have been a local commanding officer, which stated that he had inspected them and then assisted their military development by demonstrating a manoeuvre on how to deal with the enemy using knife and bayonet. Sean Riley comments that Hitler, if he had attempted, would never have taken the Springfield Dam or Marshall's Biscuit Factory if Mackie's Home Guard had been defending them. The famous Belfast actor J.G. Devlin, who worked in the office, was a member of the firm's Dramatic Society, and there was, as in other establishments, a war savings committee. At one time, approximately £5,000 was held in Ulster savings certificates, quite a sum. A monthly magazine was in circulation, and at the time of the Italian surrender, the editorial commented, "Remember, every weapon now produced is a step nearer victory, so get to it." Stirring words. Incidentally, Thomas Mackie, one of the two main directors, was awarded the CBE in 1943 in recognition of the firm's war effort. The other brothers, James Jr., died in this year after being a deputy lieutenant for the city of Belfast and a member of the Belfast Harbour Board. He was also very much involved in philanthropic work with the Royal Victoria Hospital, being co-founder with a Mr. Berrington of the Working Men's Committee there. After the war, Mackies returned to textile machinery. Sean says that thanks to the lease land scheme, there were now better tools and equipment for the men to work with. The workforce contracted to about 5,000 as the night shift was discontinued and a lot of the women workers laid off. Sean gripes that despite many improvements in working conditions, the wages continued to be poor in relation to some other comparable firms. He remembers the relaxation of the ban on smoking after the war for employees and the move of a large part of the business to what was known as the Woodvale site further up the Springfield Road. In fact, he moved to work there and spent the rest of his working life with the firm there. In August 1956, Mr. Tom Mackie died, and so the very early family connections with the firm were severed. It is said he had a magnificent collection of flowers in his garden. Control now passed finally to the hands of the third generation of Mackies, James Jr. and Tom's sons. The family grave is in the Belfast City Cemetery. By the late 1960s, Mackies remained one of the most important firms in the world, continuing to make the full range of textile machinery as well as machines for the synthetic fibre industry. Even at this stage, they employed between 5,000 and 6,000 personnel, and folk remember the sight of thousands of men pouring out of the place with darkened faces. Sean remembers the 1974 UWC strike, which was well supported by the workers of Mackies. He recalls, though working right through it, but was not personally interfered with in any way. However, the grimmer realities of economic life hit Mackies in the 1980s, as it did many other leading firms in the Belfast area. The so-called troubles of the late 20th century did not help firms like Mackies, which had depended so much on export orders. Closing his memoirs in 1993, Sean commented that by then the Mackies' first site on the Springfield Road had closed. After this, part of that site was developed as a centre for community facilities, WorkNet, etc. The rest of it was earmarked as a university campus for Greater West Belfast. To date, the dream of the university campus remains unrealised. When President Bill Clinton first visited Belfast in the autumn of 1995, if my memory is right, he made a keynote speech from the Mackies site at the Woodvale factory, where the company had moved to after the closure of Springfield Road. Today, Mackies as such has gone, and with it all that is redolent of a bygone industrial age. Let's leave the last words to Sean. Near the end of his memoirs, he asks himself the question, would he do it all again? Unhesitatingly, he answers, of course I would. Few people would say this of their employment, I feel. Despite all his travails in the place for 45 years, it must not have been too bad, after all, to work there.
Jim O'Hagan bringing us the story of a famous Belfast enterprise. Well, now at the start of a new year, Roy Irvine here. Happy New Year, Roy.
Happy New Year, Walter, and to the listeners.
Yes, we've got some resolutions for today and maybe some ideas associated with a new and a fresh start.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, no definite resolutions, but it's more the attitude that one has